North America, the native land of multiple groups of First Nations peoples. Carbon and radiometric dating indicates that the first peoples to come to North America did so as much as 30,000 years ago, most likely by crossing over the land bridge that once joined Asia and North America together. These people are now known as the First Nations peoples of Canada. But of course, they weren't the only people on Earth. Europeans. They were explorers, voyagers, and pioneers. But unlike the indigenous, they only began to arrive in North America around the 14th century. The British and French came to North America to conquer the land and to claim it as theirs. As the two groups of people continued to expand and develop across the continent, it was inevitable that they would amalgamate in one way or another. And unfortunately, this would result in many short as well as long-term problems and damage that would affect the indigenous First Nations peoples for centuries to follow. These are the stories of settler versus indigenous conflict. Data indicates that the first indigenous people to arrive in North America did so as much as 30,000 years ago. We are not quite sure how they got here, but it is very likely that over many decades they migrated from northern Siberia in modern-day Russia across the once frozen Bering Strait and into what is now Alaska. The first groups of people would remain undisturbed for almost 300 centuries. As the millennia passed, more people arrived and spread out over the vast continent. They multiplied in numbers and built settlements. Multiple languages developed alongside a deep-rooted culture and spiritual beliefs. Now fast forward about 29,000 years and travel to the East Coast. The first contact between Europeans and indigenous people likely occurred around the 11th century. The indigenous people's first contact with the white man was likely not with European explorers, but rather with Vikings. There is evidence of trade occurring between the First Nations peoples and the Vikings. The Vikings most likely encountered the Algonquin and the Inuit peoples, who they called the Skraeling in their language of Norse. It didn't take long, however, for conflicts to break out. Some accounts suggest that fights broke out after the Vikings refused to sell the First Nations people weapons, and some of the Vikings were forced to retreat to their settlements in Greenland. It was not until the 15th century that the Europeans would come to North America. Christopher Columbus, who is often wrongly credited with discovering North America, set sail in 1492 in search of India. When he landed on the shores of North America, he believed that he had found India, and this is where the incorrect term Indians originated. After that, more nations began sending ships and people over to the New World. Over time, villages were developed and the population and economy began to grow, fueled mainly by the lucrative fur trade. Multiple nations began to colonize the land. In Canada, mainly Britain and France. Resources indicate that the French were far nicer to the indigenous than the British were. The French set up trades with the indigenous, and some of the French residents even married into indigenous families. This biracial mating resulted in the birth of another group of indigenous peoples, the Métis. The British, on the other hand, simply tried to ignore their existence for the first several decades that they resided there. They truly believed that the land was theirs and no one else's. They'd kill the indigenous if they interfered with their process of colonization. Regardless of who the colonizer was, both British and French people had never seen anyone who looked or talked the way the indigenous did, and both were intruding on what was the indigenous people's land for millenniums before they had arrived, and both groups didn't seem to care about that too much. Several groups of First Nations people put up a good fight when the Europeans tried to conquer their land, but they were often far too underpowered to take on the technologically advanced Europeans. Thus, many groups of First Nations people didn't even try to defend their territory as the Europeans continued to push further and further to the west. Some of the conflicts that affected the First Nations peoples were explorers like Jacques Cartier, kidnapping chiefs and bringing them back to Europe, or Samuel Champlain, making vows to wipe out entire groups of indigenous people. They suffered during the War of 1812, and wars like the Fox and the Iroquois Wars. All these events over the course of centuries damaged the indigenous people and culture greatly. However, the following decades will only sink them deeper into this metaphorical hole that even today we are still trying to pull them out of. It's the 1860s. Indigenous people have been suffering at the hands of the white man for 2 centuries. They're underrepresented, mistreated, and abused. Pre-Confederation Canada had a population of about 3.4 million, and had developed a government that would be capable of running an independent country. In 1867, Britain allowed Canada to become independent, and the country of Canada was born under the rule of the country's first Prime Minister, John Macdonald. This was an exciting time for many Canadians. However, for the Indigenous, things would only get worse. Under the direct order of John A. Macdonald, the Indian Act was instituted, forbidding the Indigenous peoples from expressing their culture. Ceremonies were illegal, and the First Nations people were given land called reserves. Their life was greatly confined to these reserves, with very few exceptions. Reserves were often, and still are, under some of the poorest living conditions. Tap water was undrinkable, and many of these reserves did not even have running water. On top of that, potentially the most damaging component in the history of Canada's racism against the Indigenous peoples: residential schools. Although they were known as schools, they were hardly a school in any sense. Kids as young as 4 and 5 were taken away from their Indigenous families and brought to one of these schools, where they would live for a good part of the year. The goal of these schools was to assimilate young children into the Christian European culture, thus killing off the Indigenous culture in the new generations. This was by all means an attempt at cultural genocide. Another way that the Canadian government isolated the Indigenous children from their culture was the 60s Scoop, where children were taken from their Indigenous parents and put in a foster home, with Christian and white parents. Children in the schools and sometimes in the foster homes were physically, verbally, and sexually abused. An estimated 150,000 children attended these residential schools, with over 6,000 estimated deaths. Hundreds of accounts suggest that children were underfed, overworked, and severely punished. Belts, paddles, and rulers were used to hit children. Children were often punished with manual labor, and other punishment methods included cages and electric chairs. Residential schools were active all across Canada all the way up until 1996, only 26 years ago. However, not everything was going poorly for the Indigenous people at the time. For example, in 1960, people of, quote, Indian status were allowed to vote for the first time, and more European citizens were realizing that what was happening was wrong. But Indigenous people still faced bias and racism left and right. They were widely viewed as outcasts and abnormal. As the 2000s rolled around, the Canadian people and government began to realize just how wrong what they had done in the past was, and apologies and acts of reconciliation began to spread in the media. Indigenous culture slowly became more and more accepted, and the Indigenous peoples began to gain recognition and respect. One of the most notable and important acts was Prime Minister Stephen Harper's address to the Indigenous peoples in 2008, an apology on behalf of all of Canada for the wrongs that were done in the past, primarily residential schools. This, of course, did not solve the problem that many Canadians and Indigenous peoples faced as a result of the wrongs, but it certainly was a major leap in the right direction. That same year, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. Over the years, under Conservative and Liberal governments, billions of dollars have been invested into the Indigenous community supports. Treaty land acknowledgements are delivered at sporting events, concerts, schools, and theaters. Programs often start with an acknowledgement of the treaty land that the facility is located on, and the groups of Indigenous peoples that the land originally belonged to. This raises awareness about the Indigenous people's situation, and it shows recognition and respect for the Indigenous peoples. Indigenous perspectives have been incorporated into the school curriculums. This includes grade levels from elementary to post-secondary education. Some schools in Winnipeg now incorporate language and culture teachings for Indigenous groups like Ojibwe and Cree cultures. These include cultural meals, smudges, dances, and visits from elders. We are still far from perfect, however. Small-scale conflicts happen on a daily basis, and more large-scale conflicts also occur every now and again. Some examples of modern settler versus Indigenous conflicts are the 2020 Micmac lobster fishing dispute, a dispute regarding Indigenous versus non-Indigenous fishing rights. Also disputes about major pipelines or power lines running across Indigenous land. Many people still possess racist and biased views about Indigenous people, usually because they do not fully understand their past. Many people think it is up to the government or people in power to make change. However, just regular citizens have a grossly underestimated potential to make change. So we challenge you, the viewer, to go, make change. In your own thinking, in other people's thinking, or in the real world. Volunteer, have conversations, spread information for the greater good of not only Indigenous people, but all of us as Canadians, as we reconcile for our past and help to the best of our ability to bring justice and equality in Canada for all.